Companies in the past could keep unprofitable products and customers in the hope that one day they would become profitable because the winners would more than compensate for the losers. In today's economy, the margin of error is much smaller and pressures are increasing on companies to improve their bottom line performance. The knowledge of the real cost of a product or service and to the cost to serve specific channels and customers is very important to a company in today's competitive market. Logistics costing systems should be capable of not only identifying the costs that result from providing customer service in the marketplace, but also enabling separate cost and revenue analysis to be made by customer type and by market segment or distribution channel. Managers, therefore, need to be able to calculate the cost to serve for each customer and, where possible, the warehousing costs for each product. In this lecture, we're going to look at two types of costing systems which are relevant to warehouse operations. These are traditional costing methods and activity-based costing. Traditional costing models tend to allocate overhead costs arbitrarily. In the table, we show a typical warehouse cost structure in terms of storage. Let us assume that our warehouse is 10,000 multiplied by 1.5 meter height pallet locations. From a cost point of view, each location costs $167.7 per annum. In order to allocate the overhead costs, we need to add a further 24% to this figure, which comes to a total of $275.95. In terms of labor, if we assume total labor hours within the warehouse each year are 120,000 hours, our labor cost is $10 per hour. By adding the overhead, our cost comes to $12.40. Taking this one step further, if we look at customer A here, who uses a large number of warehouse labor hours and space, his pull on management time, for example, is low. He's penalized for the way the overhead costs have been allocated. We will look at how shared user warehouses can calculate storage and labor later in this section. With the proliferation of products and service complexity, a single overhead rate is no longer sufficient. In most cases, overhead does not reduce as labor or equipment reduces. Therefore, as volume reduces overhead, as a percentage of direct cost actually increases. Overhead rates are also based on predicted volumes or utilization, and therefore, as utilization reduces, the percentage of allocation of overhead needs to increase. For instance, if you look back at the shared user in the warehouse and customer A, if he decides to reduce his stock holdings and it is not replaced by another client, the charge per location needs to be increased. Based on a reduction of 500 pallets, his overhead contribution reduces by 2.7%, or $20,125. Yet the overhead cost to the company is unlikely reduced in the short term. As can be seen, traditional costing methods have a number of weaknesses, which is why many companies are turning to other methods of costing, such as activity-based costing. It looks to allocate indirect costs to processes in the way that are accurately reflecting how the costs are actually incurred. This is in contrast to traditional costing. When looking to introduce an ABC model, you need to have a comprehensive knowledge of the company, its operations, and the roles of each of the staff members. This is normally conducted by observing the operations for a period of time and recording how long it takes for each activity. A good guideline for selecting the cost drivers that most accurately reflect the cost of performing an activity is to ask people who do that work what would increase or decrease the time and effort required to do their job. Here's an example. Once all the operation and overhead costs have been calculated and each customer's pull on the services has been documented, companies can calculate the profitability of each client and see how they affect the cost structure of the business. The overhead should be allocated based on the actual management time dedicated to each activity and each customer. Cost of calls, printing, etc. should be allocated on a usage basis, for example. This analysis of overhead is likely to be the most complicated to perform. This is the main difference between ABC and traditional methods, where the latter overheads are allocated across all activities as a percentage of cost. With ABC, it is necessary to carry out in-depth studies over a period of time in order to find the relationship between overhead, services, and customers. Once all the activities have been evaluated and costs allocated to customers, there is likely to be some unused capacity. For instance, a warehouse with a total capacity for storage of 10,000 pallets is not going to be 100% occupied. Similarly, not all of the manual handling equipment and labor hours will be allocated to individual customers in total. It is therefore very useful to produce a table indicating the degree of utilization for all those areas. These costs either need to be managed out of the operation through a reduction in labor and equipment, for instance, or taken into account when initially quoting the customer or allocating to a particular product, or accepted in the short term as inevitable costs and work towards increased utilization or throughput to allocate these costs to a new product or client. As we said previously, a warehouse cannot efficiently operate if it is 100% occupied. Therefore, there have to be some empty pallet locations. Similarly, with labor, we have to take into account breaks during the workday. In this table, we show an example of the ABC model. We have calculated the number of pallet spaces occupied and the number of labor and mechanical handling hours allocated to each customer. We have also allocated the management time in hours per customer and allocated overhead costs such as postage, legal expenses, etc., on a percentage basis based on administrative hours. Those hours can be further broken down into individual activities within the warehouse and the cost allocated by customer. These costs then can be compared to actual charges levied to the customer and any shortfall examined. Having calculated all of these, we're also able to see the amount of unused capacity within the warehouse. The disadvantages of using activity-based costing include the amount of work involved and difficulty in collecting accurate data. Implementation can take time, and there needs to be a cost-benefit analysis in terms of time taken and the benefits accrued.